Welcome back to Series 3 of Beyond the Books with me, Beth Price. This podcast goes behind the scenes in the School of Literatures, Languages and Cultures at the University of Edinburgh, otherwise known as LLC. Every episode, I sit down with one of the researchers in LLC to find out about how they came to Edinburgh, what they're researching, and more importantly, why they're researching that. As a small disclaimer for this episode, we do talk about some adult topics, some slightly explicit topics, so if you're not comfortable with that, please skip this episode and go on to something else, but otherwise, stay around and listen to our wonderful conversation. Today, I am joined by fellow PhD student Madeleine Banatvala. Having previously studied in Paris, London and Oxford, Madeleine is at the end of her second year of a PhD in French Studies funded by the Scottish Graduate School for Arts and Humanities Doctoral Training Partnership. Her current research explores unconventional female friendship, identity and sexuality through the works by French authors Violette and Simone de Beauvoir. Thank you so much for joining me. Hello.
Thank you. Hi.
I think we should probably also say, for disclosure, that we are friends.
Yes, we are.
So this is possibly slightly less formal than some of the other interviews, which is nice. So, as I've pronounced them, Violette Leduc and Simone de Beauvoir. Can you tell me a little bit about both of them?
Well, I guess I'll start with Simone de Beauvoir. I think she's considered the feminist of the 20th century in France, but also across Western research. She is much more well-known than Violette Leduc. She came perhaps to the height of her career in about 1954 and is most often associated with Jean-Paul Sartre. In fact, one of the most comments I always have is, yes, you mean the wife of Jean-Paul Sartre, or you mean the girlfriend of Jean-Paul Sartre, or I hear Jean-Paul Sartre influenced Beauvoir. She was most famous for writing Le Deuxième Sexe, which is a monstrous piece of about 1,000 pages, and perhaps most quoted for saying that on n'est pas femme, on le devient. One is not born a woman, one becomes.
And then what about Violette?
Yeah, so Violette Leduc was a contemporary of Beauvoir's. She's only really known in relation to Beauvoir, often because, Beauvoir referred to her in her autobiographies. I think in many ways she's a much more complicated writer in terms of her personality and what she writes. She perhaps tends to topics which are much more controversial. She's much more of what we would call an explicit writer today in terms of topics around sexuality. It's difficult to say when the height of her career was. Her first autobiography, La Bâtarde, which translates to The Bastard, came out in 1964, I think. That's considered where she sort of blew up in France. But even then, comparatively, Beauvoir was invited over to New York, was invited over to London, all to give lectures, and she travelled extensively and was invited by well-known people to travel and to give lectures, whereas Violette Leduc, big readership by the time she's writing her first autobiography, but not quite on the same level, as it were.
Do you think part of that is because of Simone's association with Sartre?
To some degree. There's a part of me which wants to say she was in the right place at the right time. Mm-hmm. That's not to suggest that she could have got to that status or the place where she was in terms of being as renowned as she was if she wasn't who she was. In the French education system, we have what's called the agrégation, and that is a competitive exam. And she came second that year, just after Sartre, who notably was retaking the exam for the second time. She was absolutely brilliant. Was a teacher for many years and was one of those annoying lecturers who got up with no notes and lectured for 2 hours brilliantly on the subject. Beauvoir finishes her sort of education, let's say, around 1930. So Paris in the 1930s, you're coming off the back of Gertrude Stein and, Hemingway, and you've got the whole American circle there.
People like Picasso lived there for a while, Gauguin lived there.
Beauvoir lived 15 minutes away from the École Normale Supérieure, which is where any philosopher who wants to be a philosopher in France then went to, and where women weren't admitted before, you had unbelievable access. Where Violette Leduc, I think partly because they came from very different backgrounds. Beauvoir was bourgeois, Catholic, brought up in elite circles in Paris, whereas Violette Leduc was brought up in the north, working class. She did not have the same access to education. I don't think she finished her secondary schooling, really. So they come from very different places. Access to things were wildly different.
So then how did Simone and Violette meet? How did their paths cross?
I've read so many accounts of this story that it slightly changes depending whether you read Violette's version, Simone's version, or other people's. So if I remember correctly, Violette le Duc, so during the war, she was outside of Paris in the north, and I think either it was by one of her friends, Maurice Sacks, who was a big French writer as well, or it might have been somebody else, but she came across Beauvoir's already published book called L'Invité, which is the English translation that She Came to Stay. So Violette came across this book and read it and thought it was brilliant and couldn't believe it was written by a woman. I think Beauvoir's account is that she was standing in line in a cinema and this woman came up to her quite abruptly. That may be just my remembering from one of the autobiographies. Otherwise, Violette gets introduced by somebody else or gets a mutual friend to introduce them. And she basically shoves a piece of work into Beauvoir's hand and says, read this, please.
And it worked.
Yes, it was a very odd relationship.
Then how did you come to a PhD project on these two women?
I did my master's at UCL and I was doing a philosophy module, which was looking at Simone de Beauvoir, part of it. And so I wrote an essay on Simone de Beauvoir. And then I ended up really fascinated with all her stories and the personal side of the letters going around it and accounts from her ex-students on what she was like as a teacher. And I became particularly taken by her essay called Pour une morale d'ambiguïté, which is an ethics of ambiguity, which I really, really loved. Which I think is actually a really good way to be introduced to Beauvoir because it's not too long.
It's not 1,000 pages.
No, it's only 150 or something, and it's a good little essay and rather pertinent, I think, to our generation's issues and problems around anxiety. So I looked at that. I was vaguely aware of Violette le Duc, and I spoke to a really lovely academic from Oxford who said, go ahead, sounds great. If you're looking to get funding, you need something more niche and something which will make people say, oh, I've never heard of this person, or oh, this hasn't been researched. So hence I just decided to go with Violette le Duc as well.
Why then Edinburgh?
A few things. You follow the funding and you follow your supervisors. And I had Susie Bainbrigg and Claire Boyle, both wonderful supervisors. They've been so supportive for my whole project. So that's part of the reason why I came to Edinburgh as well, which was lovely because previous university experiences I've had have always been very, very little in terms of how big the class has been. Or when I was at UCL, we were during lockdown. So here I felt I arrived a little later to the university experience, but for the first time I got that full-on university experience, which was a delight.
And then from the master's, was it almost a straight line to the PhD? Like you wanted to keep going?
Oh, 100%. I definitely wanted to keep going. In my mind, I was like, I'm going to do the PhD next. I was advised to take a year after the master's because it would take me time to sort out the project, get the funding, which I did. And then I didn't get the funding. So then I persevered for another year after that and got a job. I mean, I had a job for the 2 years and then only then got funding.
Me too.
It's a very difficult thing in terms of when a lot of people are very, if you don't get it, move on.
Yeah, I think that's probably something that we have in common. I think it's something that a lot of other PhD students in LLC have in common. I don't think anybody's there on a whim. Nobody's gone, oh, I tried once and it didn't work. Everybody's there because it's something that they really feel passionate about.
I think it's very difficult to do a PhD unless you're to some degree self-driven or self-motivated. I was speaking with a colleague the other day, an ex-colleague in my work, and she was saying, how is it that you manage to take yourself in every day 9 to 5? But you don't have to, so you can just take the day off.
Also, perhaps the benefit of taking a year or two between a master's and a PhD is that certainly I learned how to do a 9 to 5.
Agreed.
And it just becomes, you know what, it is actually easier to drag myself out of bed at 7:30 and then log off at 6.
It gave me such a rhythm.
Yes.
And respect for that rhythm.
Yeah, which is something that I did not have when I was an undergraduate. So on the idea of motivating yourself day in, day out, you deal with really big philosophical ideas in your research. You look at things like selfhood, you look at things that I've had to look at Wikipedia for, like theories of time, which I didn't know existed. How do you do big concepts like that on an everyday basis?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, first, I would say that I don't really look at theories of turn anymore. But in terms of the other big concepts, I think that's part of existentialism, really. And certainly in terms of Beauvoir's existentialism, which is about taking the everyday concepts and situating them within everyday life. I use the theory of Svetlana Boym, who is a professor at Harvard, who most famously people know her for writing on nostalgia. But she wrote a theory called the Offmon. So it's a genealogy of modernity, but it looks very specifically at philosophical theories, but in the everyday. And I suppose a good example, like I said before, is if you look at the ethics of ambiguity and look at how Beauvoir talks about ambiguity in relation to, for example, today, how that might be applied to our generation's feeling toward anxiety. And there is a big point in case to be made that fundamentally our generation is just going through a giant existential crisis. And then a lot of the ideas and theories that have been looked at in the 1940s and 50s are very relatable to today. I also find that a lot of these philosophical concepts or topics are only really valuable to us if we do apply them to our everyday. And therefore making them tangible is important.
I suppose that's one of the criticisms of philosophy, is that it's privileged people sitting in cloistered rooms talking about these big concepts without application to the everyday.
I 100% absolutely agree, and especially within the French context. Philosophy is considered a major subject in terms of, I think there was a statistic that came out that something like only 1 out of 5 presidents in France had not studied philosophy.
Right.
Or 1 out of 10 or something ridiculous. Almost everybody in France goes through a level of education which involves philosophy in some way. I mean, I think it's put into the secondary school curricula. It's built into their systems, and it is very prestigious and elitist in France. And so too is the history of philosophy. I mean, I'm looking at female friendship, and I've just written a whole chapter on how female friendship has been entirely marginalised in scholarship until the 1990s, really. Whenever you think about your great writers on friendship, you think about Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, Montaigne, and all of them only discuss friendship in terms of between men. I mean, Montaigne goes so far as to say that women don't have the mental capabilities to deal with friendship. And then something interesting happens, so that even in the 80s, when post-second wave feminism, you have people starting to discuss female friendship, but only in terms of, let's not forget it's here, yay, let's celebrate female friendship. Not, let's develop a theory around female friendship.
Interesting.
There's a really good example about how you look at big philosophical concepts. The idea of friendship, which even for Plato comes from Eros, around his philosophy around love, and is a major philosophical concept. And yet, friendships between women have dominated society, both Western and other societies, since forever. And it's fascinating that these just haven't been explored properly. And even today, if you look at all the different ranges of possibilities of different friendships we have, specifically in considering the technology we have today, it seems more fascinating in terms of the philosophies that might back those.
Yeah, I suppose the application of that is I have very long-term friends who now don't live anywhere near me. But when we actually see each other, it's like no time has passed. Yeah. How do you maintain that kind of a relationship?
Yeah. And what goes into that relationship? What is required for a relationship like that? Is it loyalty or commitment? And what drives a relationship? What makes you want to sustain it? What are the circumstances in which that might fizzle away? And is it okay when a friendship fizzles away? And how do you look at relationship in relation to sexuality? And where do different kind of relationships sit along that continuum, so to speak? It feels more relevant today and important today. Everyone else will know that there's probably somebody in their office who you know very well and who you say hello to every day, but you might not have met or hung out with outside of that workspace.
Yeah.
What are those kind of relationships? How do we define them? Are they important? I can't, in my thesis doesn't have the space even to begin to commit to discussing all of those in depth. And specifically between women, if society puts women in particular situations, out of those situations, particular friendships arise which cannot necessarily exist for men. And therefore, what categories or taxonomies of friendship might exist for us that might not exist for men.
There has to be a limit to a PhD thesis at the end of the day.
Sadly.
And you're looking at writings by Violette and Simone, and some of them are posthumous writings.
Yes.
So they were published after they died, and or off limits to scholars. So I guess first question is, what is off limits to scholars practically?
Okay, well, let's first address this idea of what's off limits. I think it's less what's off limits to scholarship, because supposedly nothing is much off limits to scholarship, though there is a big, what does scholarship ignore or marginalise? That's more pertinent to some of the texts that I'm exploring. But what has been off limits, for example, the first text that I'm exploring of Violette Leduc is Thérèse and Isabelle, which is basically a lesbian relationship between two girls, one of whom is 17 and the other is 18, going on in the 1930s in France, which was censored when she first wrote it. So what is off limits or has been off limits to readers and certain scholars until it came out, those very explicit topics that it talks about, and what is fundamentally a relationship between a minor and a major.
Was that a work that was restricted during her lifetime and is now just the publishing landscape's different and that's why it's accessible?
Yes and no. The way it was published was super messy. So she tried to publish in 1954, it was denied, then it was technically published, but only by her friend, and I think about 11 copies to very personal friends. And she had to cut scenes, rewrite, and originally that text, Thérèse and Isabelle, was part of a bigger novel called Ravages. And to get Ravage published, she had to cut the whole of Thérèse and Isabelle. And when she did, this sent her largely to hospital. It was based on a true story that she'd experienced. And when it was censored, the editor, the very white male editor at the publishing house Gallimard, Jacques Le Marchand, said, if we publish this, it will bring scandal. So then the novel Ravage was published in 1955. Thérèse and Isabelle was censored basically until 1966, I believe. And even then, snippets of it came out in her autobiography in 1964, La Bâtarde, but then it came out as its own text in 1966. But even then, about half of the text was only published, not all of it. And then finally, I think in about 2000, 30 years after she died, it had come out. And then in 2024, it was reintegrated into the novel Ravage, which is how she originally wanted it. So yeah, the publishing journey was really, really messy and obscure. So what has been accessible to scholars has only really existed since about 2000.
Then how are they different from, or are they different from works which were more readily published?
The other text I'm looking at, which only came out in 2020, called Les Inséparables, The Inseparables, which was by Beauvoir about her childhood friendship with her and her best friend Zaza. This is supposedly was sort of auto-fiction, fictional piece. Wasn't really ready for publication. She'd written 2 chapters of it and then gave it up because Sartre said it didn't really hold up.
He's back.
Yeah.
Sartre's back.
It was like, this is going to be of no interest to anybody, a friendship between 2 girls growing up. To which, interestingly, she agreed. She said, oh, well, I suppose he's right. So that came out in 2020 and that is very much unfinished. And I suppose the topic feels quite new for Beauvoir. It doesn't feel necessarily like a different voice or a different perspective so much as it feels like a new topic for her, which is why it's gained such recent academic interest.
I suppose the thing that I had thought of, thinking about accessibility to texts and posthumous works, is Joan Didion's letters, autobiography. They're very recently published posthumously. And there's been some debate as to whether it was an ethical choice to publish them.
Right.
Because she had not published them during her
Yes.
life. Maybe less for Violette's work, because you said she tried to get it published.
Yeah, for sure.
But for Beauvoir, what's your thinking on the ethics of posthumous publishing?
I mean, it's a really difficult thing because there's at a certain point you say how many centuries have gone by after an author and what do we look at, what don't we look at. I suppose very specifically in relation to Beauvoir and Les Inséparables, her adopted daughter, Sylvie Le Bon de Beauvoir, is still alive today. and chose to publish that. I think, if anything, it opens up a new moment in Beauvoir scholarship where I feel it had fizzled out in the last 10 years, and there's less excitement around Beauvoir's work, perhaps understandably, as we move over to more modern feminisms and ideas around feminism. But what this does point to, especially as it was written just after her first big book, Les Mandarins, I think it shows her attempt to go back to a topic which she had previously wanted to talk about in her first novel in the early 30s, but which was then rejected by publishing houses, and which she then just came away from, but which she then later published in the 70s. And I think what you see is how she continually returns to this topic of her and her childhood friend, and how it's either been ignored by publishing houses, or they don't want to publish it, or is not of interest. And there is a point to be made there, or something to be made there, in which we say, what is society willing to publish and not willing to publish? And who's controlling that? And so today, people are very keen to publish it because they think, look at what did exist, but which has been historically ignored or marginalised. What do you think?
I work in archives more than with text, and something that I have changed my opinion on quite significantly since starting my PhD. So I look at female nudity in published magazines. So they were professionally published magazines. These were circulated widely publicly, and a lot of them are... My whole argument is that it was this supposedly neutral image of a naked woman, of the female nude as an artistic thing, and how that got co-opted, how that got used. But the thing that has changed my mind on the archive being quite neutral and saying, oh, well, these were published, these were public things, is trying to trace the provenance of the images. Yeah. And for a lot of the artworks that are reproduced in these magazines, it's one thing, it's plagiarism, but it was the 1920s, it was the 1930s. It's a different conversation about where you got that copy of this oil painting from. For sure. But it's the pictures. So in a lot of my magazines, there are pictures of quite young women. They're usually of white women, and they're dancing or they're posing, and they're usually in these magazines with captions like "the beautiful gymnast," "the artistic dancer," "elegance," very sort of aesthetically feminine things. There is a scholar called Sun Liying who traced where these images came from in a different magazine published at the same time by the same circles, and she's found that they're all erotic postcards. They're all French erotic postcards that were sold as erotica.
Oh, interesting.
And then they've got reproduced in these Chinese magazines as
elegant and
artistic, beautiful.
Yeah, interesting, very interesting.
And so because of that, and because you're looking at these pictures of women and also reading about the environments in which they were working as artists' models or as photographers' models or as young actresses, I'm going, actually, there is a lot of ethics to consider in this. It's not a neutral space. I can't justify it on, it was in the public sphere.
There's a whole theory I find often actually academics are very keen that you should trace the publication theory of, as in you should look into publication theory and trace how certain of these works are published and why they are published in certain and which publishing houses are publishing them. Yeah. And again, in France, you look at the major publishing house Gallimard, which is considered the dominant publishing house, perhaps a bit like Penguin. To be published with Gallimard is a very, very...
You've made it if you're being published by them.
Very big, yeah, exactly. But understanding who's publishing that, why they're publishing it. I mean, also very notably today, and even actually in the 70s, by the time Beauvoir was as big as Beauvoir was, and as she is now, her name is a bit like clickbait. As a feminist, if you mention her name somewhere, immediately you will be drawing a lot of people, either because she's a controversial figure or because she's considered, ironically, the mother of feminism.
I suppose that goes back to what we were saying at the very beginning. It's about the circles that she was moving in through the upbringing meant that her writings, her work had that prestige and that circulation.
And I suppose what society and scholars and publishing houses focused on. So they were focusing on white bourgeois women in the West, not black women in the 1800s.
Even working class women also in the West.
Or working class women in the West, or, in so many variants. I mean, yes, Beauvoir was a fantastic philosopher and wrote many great things, many controversial things in feminism as well. But, I mean, there is a reason why she's very associated with pre-second wave feminism.
Yeah. As you say, Beauvoir is not associated with sort of contemporary feminism, very much pre-second wave feminism.
Yeah.
And we've talked about these big philosophical ideas like friendship, and we've talked about the fact that apparently every French president has studied philosophy.
Maybe that's an exaggeration.
A substantial majority of French presidents have studied philosophy formally. Yes. That's something that doesn't really get supported so much, particularly in the UK context. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, do you think that there is a way that we, maybe as junior academics, maybe as people doing outreach like podcasts, how do you think we can actually get people to connect with ideas like this?
I mean, that's interesting. I think my initial instinct is to say, well, you put it in the curriculum. It shocks me that you don't have things like philosophy in the curriculum, because philosophy shouldn't be solely a higher educational subject or topic. It shouldn't be seen as, grandiose at any point. If you're going to make these topics or study these topics and make them relevant to everybody, we need to make sure that they're in the public school system, where students say often, why are we being taught Pythagoras' theorem, but we are not being taught how to deal with a mortgage at school? Part of introducing philosophy into a curriculum will be about saying, let us teach our next generation on emotional intelligence and about the way we interact with the others and the world around us, our morals and ethics. And I do know that it does exist, but often my experience has been that it exists only in private schools or in select state schools. It is not across the board. And yet people want to relate to it all the time. People are really interested about these ideas because often they feel they're relatable and they can connect to these ideas because love and friendship and anxiety and being and commitment and loyalty are all these ideas which everybody feels on a day-to-day or experience in their daily lives.
We could absolutely go on for hours.
Yes, we could.
And we will, I'm sure. But the last formal question that I have on my list is, what advice would you give either to students in LLC already, maybe to master's students thinking of doing a PhD? What's the kind of pithy advice?
Oh, goodness. It's difficult because I'm not sure I'm on for maxims. I think I better give my advice if I'm giving it to master's students. I would actually say really don't be discouraged. I think a lot of academics, sadly, are very discouraging because it is a very tough field of work. It's very tough to get funding. It's very tough to persuade another academic to give up their time for your project. I would say if you really want it, just do not be discouraged. And people will actively say, give up and do not do this. And you're going to have to put on your big person boots and ignore them and just carry on, as it were.
I like that. It's more than just having passion. It's having that sort of dogged determination to go, no, I'm going to keep doing this, actually.
Yeah, and not to assume that simply because they're already in academia. I'm not saying don't take the advice of people who are more knowledgeable. I'm just saying that sometimes they're wrong. And you know what's best for your own life and your own projects. And trust yourself in that. What about you? What would you give advice?
Oh, God, I don't know. It's always why I ask the questions.
Exactly.
I think my sort of pithy advice to master's students is, this is a learning experience as much as it is a sort of professional project. And you're going to get better. You're going to do better writing. You're going to think more deeply. You're going to do all these different things, knowing that it's not going to be the best thing ever.
Yeah.
It's actually fine.
Yeah, it's fine.
It's fine.
You'll do fine.
Some days your PhD is going to be the best thing you've ever done and you're going to be thinking all these massive thoughts. And then other days you're going to write 3 words and hate all of them.
Yeah, precisely.
But they're all important.
Yeah, exactly.
They're all important. I say we could keep talking for hours and I'm sure we will in another context. Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much.
This has been a lovely conversation. I'm glad to have had the excuse to grill you on your research a bit more.
Oh, it's been lovely.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Books, and thank you again to Madeleine Banatvala for joining me. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more of my conversations with researchers in LLC, you can find the rest of this series on Apple Podcasts or on YouTube. Search for @the University of Edinburgh LLC, all one word. If you head to the university website, which is llc.ed.ac.uk/research/beyond-the-books, you can find not only the rest of this series with me, but series 1 and 2 as well, hosted by Emma Aviette and Ellen Davis Walker. For now, it is goodbye from me. I have been Beth Price, and this has been Beyond the Books.